everybody. I'm Better Believe Steve, and welcome to another episode of Streets, where we, the homeless citizens of Washington, D.C., strive to reach, educate, and transform society's views on homelessness. Today, we're at the Central Union Mission in Northwest D.C., and I have with me today some of my Streets team homeless advocates. Today I have with me Mr. Serge Thomas. Mr. Serge Thomas is actually a resident here at the Central Union Mission. Joining him, I have the world-renowned Mr. Eric Sheptock, and I have a leading homeless advocate in the community, Mr. Skip Watkins. Up on stage, it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Laura Zeilinger. She is the Deputy Director of the Department of Human Services. Alongside her is Mr. Thomas Wells. He is the Councilman in Ward 6 and also the Chairman of the Committee on Human Services. Let's give them a round of applause. We're here today to examine the accountability, the services, the housing, and the transparency of the district as it has to do with the homeless community. And we're going to start by asking Laura to give us an update on what DHS is doing in the homeless community and maybe say a little something about HPRP.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, first I want to just start by thanking you for inviting me to be here today. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Central Union Mission for graciously hosting us and for Streets TV for this dialogue. The Department of Human Services, we strive to make homeless policy in collaboration with the people who are directly affected by that. And these dialogues are very important in informing the decisions that we make and improving the work that we do. The District of Columbia, under the leadership of Mayor Fenty, is committed to ending homelessness in our community through multiple interventions and multiple activities. We don't believe that anyone should have to be homeless in our nation's capital, and that we can rally together with the appropriate resources, the appropriate services, and working together as a community to really address the issue. We have launched a permanent supportive housing initiative, which is one of, I think, of our most exciting and innovative programs that we have going on in DC government today, that is working to finally address and end homelessness one person at a time for those that are most vulnerable, with the most barriers to housing, with the highest needs in our community. We have, through just the Housing First initiative alone, just surpassed this week 525 individuals in permanent supportive housing and 71 families. And we continue to house people in that program every single day. The stories of the individuals in the program are, we say those big numbers and they sound great, but what is really touching is the stories and the struggles of the individuals who have experienced decades of homelessness and taken their lives back and are reintegrated into our community. So we're excited to move forward with that initiative. It's been recognized by our president in an appropriation that he put forward for the district that we're hoping will make it through the budget process so that we can continue this momentum and end homelessness for those that are chronically homeless. But we recognize that homelessness in the district has many different faces, and everybody's situation is different, and we need a variety of different interventions to really thoroughly address the problem. One new initiative, that, Steve, that you just mentioned is the Homeless Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Program. That is a federally funded program through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the Stimulus Act. And I understand we're going to get some time to talk a little bit about that further, but that's an intervention that is going to allow us to really target those who, first and foremost, prevent new episodes of homelessness. And second, for people who have become homeless, to rapidly move them into housing in our community. So I look forward to sharing that with you, other innovative programs and partnerships that we have going on for veterans and elderly and everybody within our community who experiences or is at risk of homelessness. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Councilman Wells, it's been an interesting month in the City Council in October. We've viewed the testimonies of October the 5th and the 14th, and we were wondering maybe if you could give us an update on what's going on as far as homeless services are concerned in the district.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question, but also thank you for inviting me to be on this show, communicating with everyone that's impacted by the services of the District of Columbia, that the more that we can learn and communicate, and using mediums like this, Steve, and the work that you do, I really appreciate it. And of course, thank you to Central Union Mission for everything that you've done for, I guess, nearly 100 years or so. But Mr. Treadwell, and for your staff and everyone that's involved in helping take care of folks that need housing, thank you very much. The past month has been very difficult in my role of oversight of human services for the District of Columbia. One of the most important things that I do is that I oversee budgeting for for how much money is in the district's budget for homeless services and everything related to human services. The mayor sends down a budget. I don't do it alone. I do it in partnership with the mayor. The mayor sends down a budget, and then we see if we have enough money. We allocate the budget across the council. We make tough choices. In this period of recession, we made some very tough choices. We raised taxes, we cut services, and we certainly we ended earmarks. It was a very difficult budget season. We had to make priorities. And then when we were done with the budget, we sent it back to the mayor. The mayor signed it and moved on. Well, one of the things that part of my responsibility is to take to my other council members, and so that they are clear in my oversight with my committee's work, what are we funding and what are we not funding? And in particular, an example of that are services for the homeless. And if we're not funding it, I've got to bring that to the attention of my colleagues so that we can say, are we going to raise taxes or cut something else to be sure that we fund it? And so, for whatever reason, I think lack of communication, it could be a number of things, that the amount that we thought that we funded for emergency housing services for the homeless was not the amount that was going to be used in starting October 1 for this new fiscal year, and it really created a crisis. And so this past 30 days has been trying to understand not just, whose fault is one thing or another, but how do we move forward to get what we thought that we funded, which was the same amount of housing and homeless services that we had in the previous year.
Well, this panel of advocates that I call the street team, we've had a chance to pretty much dissect those testimonies, both the 5th and the 14th. And I'd like to give the panel an opportunity to hone in on what they perceived from these testimonies. And I'd like to start with Serge. Serge, I'd like for you to give us your perspective as it has to do with transparency in DC.
Thank you, Ms. Zeilinger and Councilman Wells, for coming to the mission. And it's an honor to talk to you about the issues concerning homelessness and also housing for homelessness. Councilman Wells, I want to express my also shared concern with you about a growing lack of transparency and miscommunication, to use your words, about the budgeting process and even just policies that are being set to help the homeless population within the district. And I do share your assessment also that whatever might have been said, might have been done about the budget, things did not necessarily work out and there was a major misunderstanding. My major cause for concern is I was listening to the tapes of the council meeting, and I know that the DHS had, Mr. Carter, had offered the creation of a post of the ombudsman for as a liaison for the district. For those who do not fully understand what an ombudsman is, it is a liaison, and I did do some research on it, and I found that the ombudsman is something he or she explains and examines concerns and complaints from outside the institutions, thus avoiding conflicts of interest inherent in self-policing. However, this is one of my major concerns, is the ombudsman system relies heavily on the selection of an appropriate individual for the office and on the cooperation of at least some effective official from within the apparatus of the institutions. My concern is that can this ombudsman position be appointed with the input of an activist, homeless activist, or be a homeless activist, and if not that, be a professional that is impartial, that everyone can respect within the process between government, the public, the council, and also the people. I offer you a solution. I think that the ombudsman should be accessible to all parties, not necessarily just to one and not the other, and should also answer to the council. The council should know what an ombudsman does at all times, just as much as the DHS head should know what the ombudsman does as well. It's a win-win for all. I also believe that once the recommendations by the ombudsman are made, that they are respected and that they are followed, unless there is a very good reason as to why what the ombudsman does recommend should not be followed. And again, I do believe that that ombudsman should speak with the activists, should speak with the public as well. And those are my concerns, and I'm sure that you and your fellow council members, in addition to the people at DHS, share those concerns as well.
If I can speak to that briefly, Steve.
Oh, go ahead, Councilman.
Well, first let me say I really appreciate and I'm impressed that you've taken the time to go through and listen to these hearings. That's what they're for. And the role of the hearings, the council, and your role, that what you bring up is that there is a very special covenant between the government, people they serve, including the people who pay for our government. And that covenant is only nurtured and maintained through transparency, trust, and that what we say is our word. And so whether it be through an ombudsman's office, or it be through the council's oversight, or through elections, that it's all about maintaining that covenant with you, Serge, and with everyone in this room that we serve, and that we say we're going to do this, we're going to fund this, and then we've got to do it. And so our words have to match our actions. And so I'm very pleased to hear that you're going through our hearings.
And we'll get a chance to discuss that a little more, a little later when we get into our discussion. Right now, I would like to go to Eric Sheptalk. And Eric, maybe you can give us your perspective on accountability in the district.
Sure. Accountability. Well, check this out. Now, we have in January, we counted 6,220 homeless people here in the district, okay? And the numbers have been increasing due to the economic downturn. And very recently, we almost lost 1,900 shelter beds. Okay, well, as it turns out, last year, the district spent $50 million on homeless services. And this year, the budget got cut down to $38 million. And long story short, to keep it simple, we have 3 programs running up $38 million, and then you get $12 million more. You create a 4th program that it turns out that was $12 million for a one-time funding stream, and that stream gets cut off. Now you have 2 choices basically. Either you can run the 4 program at 3/4 of the capacity, or you can cut out that 4th program that was created with that one-time funding stream. And so I want to call into account on why it is that you would create an ongoing program with a one-time funding stream that you know you're not going to get in the next year, okay? And then also, there's this concern from the homeless community that what's going to happen is that, you know, we saved the shelters this time around, and we're going to spend too much money on the hypothermia season, and then come springtime, they're going to be talking again about budget shortfalls, and there's going to be this threat of shutting down the shelters. And what else stood out to me in this whole debacle is that Catholic Charities more or less has a monopoly on the shelters, because when they came and they testified and they said, hey, look, you're cutting 1/3 of my budget, so if I can't do everything I used to do, if I can't have these robust services, these wraparound services, I'm going to shut down entirely. they got scared. And I mean, they scrambled to find $11 million. And thank God they found it, and the shelters have now been saved. But why would you let them get into this debacle where first of all, they have a monopoly, and then secondly, you know, when spring comes, are we going to have the same fight all over again? That's what I want to know.
Thank you, Eric. You know, you raised some interesting points there that I'm sure that Councilman Wells and Ms. Zallinger will address in a second. But right now, I'd like to go to Skip on your perspective on the district's services and housing.
Hello, Laura. It's always nice to see you. Mr. Wells, welcome. First, I wasn't sure if you were in homeless people when you first took over the council. But now, the last few months, you're doing a good job. We appreciate that. I got a concern about transparency dealing with the availability of housing in the district. We want to empty the shelters out, but we'll never really empty the shelters out. We want to bring them down and let the emergency shelters do what they're really supposed to do. We want to open up CRFs for people who need that type of service, SROs for people who are more stable out there, so then they can all move into permanent supportive housing, get their jobs, and then we'll take away that permanent supportive housing, and they'll have their own place. Now, I also chair COHO, and we've been concerned about this for a very, very long time. But the problem is, every time we ask the district about what's available, what can we use, we can't get an answer. Now, we don't want big old shelters, big old places like New York Avenue and CC&B. We want little small places that can blend in the community, 10 people maybe, in an SRO or CRF, with services coming in to take care of them, get them back, get them stabilized, so they go back out there and get into society and contribute. So, I'm just wondering, is there any way that we can force the current administration to take the translucency away, wipe off the windows so we can see through the transparency, so that we can see what's out there, so we can come to you, not screaming, but come to you and say, we have this over here, can you do something with this? We'd like to move these people over here. We want to cut out. Homelessness will never end. It's alpha and omega. There'll always be a need for emergency shelter. If you know, and I know, that if we can, the more people we can house, the less burden it's going to be on the finances of the government. So please, if y'all could just do something to open up that transparency so we can see what property is out there, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
You know, thank you, Skip. Councilman Wells, Lord, there always seems to be a lot of misinformation out there. You know, this street panel kind of does its homework, and we're a little more informed than the rest of the community. But we've heard a lot of good stuff from them, and I'd like to give you both a chance to comment on what you just heard. Laura, you want to go first?
Absolutely, and thank you for that opportunity. And I want to thank the panel for your research and for your remarks. And I would like to sort of clarify a couple of issues, first related to our budget, and also explaining some of our choices in spending. Everybody, I think, clearly understands that in an economic recession, we operate with less tax revenue, and that we have to look to a variety of sources of funding that are not affected by that tax revenue to fill in gaps that are created when we have less tax revenue to spend. So in our Department of Human Services, we had a cut to our overall local budget, and we had to stretch some of our federal resources to fund the breadth of programs that we offer within our agency. That resulted in less money that we traditionally had diverted toward homeless services being available, even though our local budget in that area remained constant. Our strategy on that was to work with our providers to find savings so that we could protect emergency capacity and protect our ability to provide those essential services with less resources. But before we did that, we looked at where we could contract spending in our agency. We reduced our office space and consolidated people together. We got rid of fleet. We laid off staff. We made very difficult choices to try to get as bare bones and efficient as possible in our own operations before we looked to doing anything with any of our programs. It is not that Catholic Charities stood up in a hearing and talked to other providers and talked to us about the impact, and then all of a sudden, because of that, $11 million appeared. In fact, no new money has appeared because, as a result of the elevating and voicing those concerns, except for that, as we were before, we continue to work to identify additional resources that we can use to keep our programs whole. Right now, we're in the process of sitting down with each and every provider of homeless services, together with, at times, members of the council member staff and the Community Partnership for the Prevention of Homelessness, to scrub each of those contracts to find as many efficiencies as possible in the delivery of those services so that we can protect shelter beds, essential emergency services, case management services, and still meet our obligation to the residents of the district to address those emergency needs. But I also would like to just briefly address Eric's point about, is it responsible budgeting or responsible spending to take what looks like it may be a one-time source of money and put it into recurring programs? I would argue somewhat with the premise of that question that that's what we did. That's not exactly the case. But I will tell you that we are in the process of transforming the way that the district does homeless services. 4 years, we invested in more and more and more emergency shelter beds that did nothing really but warehouse people in homelessness and meet their immediate survival needs. While that is a very important activity, that is not how you end homelessness. You end homelessness through programs that have been successful here and in other jurisdictions, like permanent supportive housing, like investments in prevention and rapid rehousing. In order to not have to stop doing one to start doing the other, sometimes you can take one-time funding to enhance those programs that provide solutions to homelessness, and then contract on the other side where we're not so wisely invested. So as we look to right-size our system, to always, of course, have those essential safety net services on the emergency side, it will take some temporary investment in more so that we can spend less on programs that are not, so that we will have less need for people to live long-term in emergency shelters, if that makes sense. And
Councilman Wells, you have a comment?
Let me just, again, the panel, you've selected a great panel, and the panel gave us some very thoughtful questions. And together, we're going to be sure that first, it's always day to day, you know that, and you live that. And so day to day, we're going to get through this hypothermia season together. And we're going to see that whoever needs shelter has shelter. And we're going to do that together, where we call it transparency, advocacy, but together we're going to do that. But I don't want to lose what Skip said. Skip really laid out a dissertation with some premises. And it is in some ways a response to what Ms. Zeilinger said on behalf of the mayor, saying, we're going to change the paradigm. We're going to focus our resources on ending homelessness. And then Skip came back. You came back with saying, now wait a minute. You're not going to ever end homelessness. We can improve services, we can get a better continuum, but we're not going to end homelessness. I want to get you to just take a step back for a moment, as I'm trying to, in my oversight. What would be different about our government's investments if they were all aligned towards ending homelessness rather than aligned towards guaranteeing and managing the system we have and the system that we've had for the past 4 or 5 years, as Ms. Zeilinger said? What would it mean for us to hold the mayor accountable for making the investments to end homelessness? If we say, when the mayor says, I'm about ending homelessness, and then we let them off the hook by saying, well, I know you're not going to do that, but how about these other things? No. Let's say, okay, end homelessness. How are you going to do it? What's it going to look like? What investments do you need to make? And if it's not in your budget, then it's talk. I think that you need to just, with me, think about, well, what if we held them accountable to that?
Thank you. You know, I've been sitting here listening, and I'm kind of lost for words, because anybody that knows me knows that I have a pretty bubbly personality and I'm outgoing. And yet when I started this show, I was stumbling and bumbling like I was nervous. And I couldn't understand why. And I'm thinking that maybe it's because that you guys are up there and you're like a judge, you know, and maybe I was feeling nervous. So can I ask you guys to come on down here on the floor and join us on the floor? Can I get somebody from Central Union Mission to give me a hand and give me a couple of chairs up here? And I want somebody grabbing that king chair up there. Let me sit in the king chair. No, put it right there. And let me sit out here and be in the king's chair. I feel a lot more comfortable that way, you know?
Now I'm intimidated.
That's more like it. That's more like it. You know, that looks like I'm running something. You know? Councilman Wells, you know, during this month there was a lot of numbers thrown around. Everybody is not the math whiz that Eric is. And, you know, I heard 63 million. I heard 48 million, I heard 32 million, you know, and that seems like a lot of money, you know, and the homeless community don't quite understand why they can't have housing. Why is no housing available? I talk to homeless men and women every day, and 95% of the questions is, how come I can't find housing? How come I can't get housing? It's housing, housing. It's always housing. Skip came up with, Skip said some good things, some SROs. Let's slip them in the communities 10 at a time. We don't, you know, communities get scared if 350 homeless folks come to the neighborhood. You know, we understand all of that. So help us to understand the numbers and help us to understand why is no housing.
Well, the first thing is, I just want to...
And before you start, excuse me, and I want you all to join in, you know, and let's see if we can talk this out.
Well, the first thing is that I was really frustrated after one of our hearings that the Washington Post said disagreement over is it 20 million or 11 million. That wasn't the point. The point was, will the services be there that we promised to be there in this coming hypothermia season? Just tell me that we're going to have at least what we had last time, because we made a commitment to fund and hold funding level. So that's the numbers. Sometimes I think I do a disservice. I'm sitting on the dais and I'm saying, well, wait a minute. You know, I thought it was this. And then next thing I know, we're arguing about numbers. We're arguing about people's lives, and that of seeing that people have the shelter that we promised. But the second thing that you just talked about, you shifted the conversation again, which I'm impressed with, from shelter to housing. When you talk about housing, you're thinking about having a home, that you got a key. You get to go to the same place. And someone's not just, you know, there at the door handing you a towel and a bar of soap and you walk in. It's your towel, your bar of soap. And that's the vision that I think that, that we need to challenge. Why do people not have housing? And so I do think that there's been a greater investment. I want to give kudos to the mayor on Housing First. And I know that a lot of people have on Housing First, because it's about a place to live, not just a place to be sheltered.
Mr. Wells, I'd like to say this, that first of all, I want to make our audience aware of the fact that the district has a responsibility to house or to shelter all homeless people throughout hypothermia, or on any day where it's 32 and below or 95 and above. And that includes the wind chill factor and the heat index. And therefore, you know, at this time of year, it's terrible for us to lose too many shelter beds. And I know you want to move away from shelter and toward housing and so forth, But you're going to need that shelter, and the amount of shelter is dictated by how many people show up needing shelter, not by how many units you think you want to produce for them. And so, I mean, there's that issue. And then finally, I want to say that as far as people not being housed is concerned, in the district, it's been determined you have to make at least $25 an hour in order to live decently in DC. If you're going to pay 30% or less of your pay towards housing, you have to make at least $4,500 a month. And yet, here in the district, the minimum wage is $8.25. And so most people, especially those in the homeless shelters, you know, there are people who are going to make maybe $10, $12, $15 an hour, you know, and so they can't really afford to live in the district, so they always need your help, even if they're housed.
I just want to say quickly, Eric's question is a great one, because when Ms. Zeilinger says on behalf of the mayor, we're going to end homelessness, and you don't believe her, and you gave the numbers why, we know that the people that got those apartments are not making $25 an hour. They have homes now.
That's
and
right.
So, but it's still challenging the disbelief. And so when you change it to, how are you going to get me housing? Not, I mean, we've got to make the commitment on shelter. It's in the law.
I think you misunderstood what I was saying. Okay, now, you can house them in a program where they're not going to pay for their housing, but I'm talking about just the average people who are not vulnerable, who are not mentally ill, who are not handicapped, and who can work, as you try to wean them off of the system and get them paying for their own place. So, and not living off of PSH or some other government program, okay, they many times are not going to make more than $15 an hour, and so they can't get out of the system. They're going to always need your assistance in some way, you know, because their pay won't pay for the rent, you know, to live on their own.
So the district has,
let me ask you, why don't you explain to us a little bit more about HPRP?
Okay, may I address that point as well?
Sure.
So the district's affordable housing plan is not only consisted of permanent supportive housing, but affordable units for people who need either a subsidy or a place that is below market. And there certainly there are a lot of things both in the pipeline and online that are meant to serve people who are below the standard area median income. And part of our Homeless No More plan is the creation of 6,000 units of affordable housing, 2,500 of which are permanent supportive, and the remainder are affordable units for just that population that you spoke of. But the reason why permanent supportive housing is important for ending homelessness, and I do believe that we can do it, is because those are the people who will just continue to stay homeless without an intervention. If you look at the statistics, the vast majority of people who experience homelessness in the district actually experience it for a week or less. But it's the people who, once they're homeless for a year or more, that generally will need a more intense intervention to move beyond. And when we ramped up the Housing First program, we saw in 1 year a 16% reduction in street homelessness. And we do believe that will lessen to some degree the demand on emergency shelter beds. And we continue to monitor our census in the shelters as well as our annual count. But I do want to respect your question, Stephen. We're very excited about the Homeless Prevention Rapid Rehousing Program, which has two components. One of it is prevention, and as I mentioned earlier, that's for people who are in imminent risk of homelessness without this intervention, who would very likely become homeless. Through that program, we can help pay rent arrears, provide utility assistance, and other assistance to help keep people housed. It is always much more expensive to try to rehouse somebody than it is to prevent their homelessness to begin with. The rapid rehousing takes people who have become homeless and need some assistance to get back into housing and maintain their housing potentially, so that they can quickly exit out of homelessness. The target population for that are people who just need some short-term assistance. We understand that people who often miss some rent, become homeless, that it is extremely difficult to save up enough money to pay first month's rent and security deposit to get into a unit. We can assist people who are qualified with that. And I think what is going to be key is the outreach, the education of people in our community about the availability of this resource, and the targeting. One thing that we're doing in order to appropriately target people for this program is designing an assessment tool and using that, really going out throughout the shelter system to feeding programs into places that touch people who are homeless in our community, to allow them to, where we can both inform people about the availability of this program and to do this screening to make the connection for people and provide them with the means to quickly exit homelessness. I keep seeing the signs. I only have a couple of minutes. There's a lot of in-depth information that I can provide, but I want to respect the time I have to speak.
And we're going to continue the dialogue because I'm going to let the streets team in on this a little bit and share some of their concerns about the program. Come on, sir.
I'm very glad that you actually brought up HPRP, and I'm also glad that you brought up the more specific and depth. I do have two concerns, or at least three, about HPRP. One, I think the time is too constricted. I know that it's a new program, but I'd like to see one day that this becomes a more permanent, ongoing program, because again, like Skip said, you're going to get some people that are going to fall through the cracks that still need help to get themselves into housing. And I also have a concern about the scope, the target. I know you said that it's a targeted program. I was wondering, would HPRP eventually hit those who, like Eric said, are, well, kind of like myself, able-bodied, for me a degree, but that's different, able-bodied, have work, want to work, but need a place to stay because the task of finding a place in the district is daunting. Would that eventually be expanded out instead of hitting families or people that are already homeless? Because it's like there's this great in-between that is being ignored by a lot of the programs, public and private, that you're just missing, like men here in this mission that need help. A lot of these men eventually are going to be ready to come and get housing, and they're going to be roadblocked. And my question for HPRP is that you need to have a case manager in order to be considered eligible for the program, or at least have a case manager in the program?
No. So I'll address both your points. The last one, case management is voluntary in the HPRP program. The timelines in it are mandated by HUD, but we do have a locally funded program here in the district.
And what is that timeline, Laura?
Up to 18 months. We have to recertify every 3 months. So someone can qualify for anywhere from 0 in the long run up to 18 months worth of rental assistance, and we intend to implement it as a graduated subsidy so that people don't sort of fall off a cliff from having their rent covered at a very high level and then all of a sudden they have a huge rent burden that they're not used to. But when we were looking at this particular opportunity in the Recovery Act, one thing we did was create a matrix, and you can find this online in the district's concept paper on the implementation of HPRP. We looked at, because we do have actually a wide variety of homeless prevention and rehousing programs here. One of them is funded with local dollars, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, ERAP. In order to qualify for that program, you have to be at or below 125% of the federal poverty level, and you need to have a minor child, have a disability, or be elderly.
What if you're single, no children?
So exactly. So we found that we were looking at where, but who's, and then there are a few other programs as well. So we looked at what are all of those programs, what is the eligibility criteria, and who is not eligible. And somebody, just that, people like exactly as you described were, and youth were sort of some of the two major areas where we said we really want to make sure that we're targeting people who are not eligible. The other thing is the 125% of the federal poverty level. We had people that we have to decline for ERAP all the time because they make $5 to however many dollars too much, but we could have prevented their homelessness.
Okay, hold on. So, I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to speak here. Come on, Eric, you have some comments to make?
Yes, I do have quite a few comments to make here. Well, first of all, I'll say that as far as HPRP is concerned, I was in a conversation with Guyton Harvey over at DHCD, that's Department of Housing and Community Development, just a few days ago, and there's some discrepancy about how you're going to assess people for HPRP. And, well, if you go to the original document of where it spells out the HPRP program, it's an 82-page document, and it says that you're going to go after the least vulnerable people, those who are most likely to find employment and get it together and get out of homelessness. But then, according to Guyton Harvey, DHCD did a concept paper just last week in which they stated that it's going to be very much like permanent supportive housing, and you're going to go after the most vulnerable. I'm getting these different stories. I did hear you mention the idea of going to the shelters and the streets to talk to people like you did with permanent supportive housing in order to find them. And so I guess my question to you then would be, are you going to just begin to house the first ones who you find who qualify for the program, or are you going to first do a certain number of assessments, maybe 1,500, 2,000, and then pick those who are most in need of it? So how are you going to assess people for this program?
And Laura, I wanted you to hold that thought for a minute, and I want to hear from Skip. But unless, if you want to elaborate now, go ahead. Go ahead, if you want to elaborate.
Okay, so I think you may be confusing two things. There's the outreach and then there's the eligibility. So we'll use the assessment tool as part of the outreach. And this is another way that we're making use of a resource in order to not just deliver this particular program, but to transform the way and improve the way we deliver homeless services. Because what we'll be able to do with that assessment tool is to understand, yes, are you an appropriate candidate possibly for HPRP, but what other services are you looking for that we could connect you to right now just by knowing that? So this assessment team will be trained in making those linkages and addressing what we hear all the time in our discussions with people in the community, that it is very difficult to be homeless and to know where to access services. And we feel like this is a great opportunity to be able to do that. So then when somebody receive this assessment, we'll be able to make a linkage to say there are these, we will select, we have an RFA out right now, a grant announcement that proposals are due on Monday. We'll select a number of grantees whose job it is to do the eligibility, to certify that somebody is eligible for this program based on the guidelines that HUD has put forward.
And what are those guidelines? I mean, are you going after those that are most vulnerable?
So no, we are not going, it's not about vulnerability. When we do permanent supportive housing, we implemented a vulnerability index that looked at what makes somebody really most at risk of dying while they're homeless, based on Healthcare for the Homeless study that was done in Boston, and a tool that an organization from New York, Common Ground, developed in order to assess that. So we looked at that. We are not looking at vulnerability here as you scored this on the vulnerability index survey, therefore you get. No. We look at what HUD, what makes sense and what HUD has put forward in the guidelines, which is basically, do you have anything in your, do you meet the income requirement? Are you at 50% of the area median income or below? So there's a means test to that. Are you homeless, or are you at imminent risk of homelessness? That's number 2. Then we look at, do you need, we'll be looking at, do you need a temporary to medium-term subsidy in order to achieve housing stability? And that's where the service component of this program comes in, which is voluntary, as I mentioned. Some folks may have some barriers to housing, but they can, within the period of time that we can assist them, achieve housing stability. But it's going to depend on their ability to access services and address some particular challenges. And so that's where they'll be referred for case management, for housing counseling, for some other services to assist them. So no, we don't make a determination based on vulnerability. It's really about people who we can assist, who are not saying, I either have no ability to pay rent ever, or no willingness, I'm just waiting for my voucher, what have you. We're looking for people who say, I need some temporary help to get into housing, but I intend that within the period allowable, I'm going to be able to be sufficient and pay my own rent, basically.
Councilman Wells, we want to get you in on this conversation here. What's your thoughts?
Well, I really appreciate it. I think Eric followed up on it, but Serge's question is, look, you've taken a group through permanent supportive housing to Housing First who really had not been able to be housed before, and you found a way to get housing for them. Then you've got these funds for families, you know, where you have one child or two children, but you have these services. Well, what about us in the middle who've been, you know, we're able-bodied, we're able to get some employment, sometimes we're way in between unemployment, we need some help with the job, but that we are, where is it for us to get housing? And I think that's a great question. It's something that, in fact, that I was, you know, meeting with my staff talking about, that we see some very smart, able-bodied, capable advocates who come and speak to us about homelessness. And I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, why can't we help you get to housing? And what programs help you? Because no, you don't look disabled. You certainly are articulate. And that, you know, you should be able to getting, you know, something has happened and you should be getting on with your life in a very respectful way with your own housing. And I think you hit right on it.
But you know, one thing that bothers me, and I know, I mean, Laura has said something opposite, but I personally, I'm bothered about the term assessment tool. I'm bothered with that term because to me, it seems like it's just a rewording of vulnerability index. Mm-hmm. You know, there's certain criteria that's going to have to be reached before you're eligible. And I'm fearful that that criteria is going to be somewhat similar, going to be very close to, you know, those, to that criteria used, you know, for the permanent supportive housing. And I don't know, maybe I'm just on edge because in this administration, everything that we've heard, it doesn't turn out the way that we think it's supposed to turn out. You know, I don't know, maybe it's just me. I don't know. Yeah.
Just hate acronyms. HPRP, I had a lot of problems with HPRP until I squared the R and made it HPR squared P. So now I understand what it is. Homelessness prevention, great. Rapid rehousing, the 2 R's next time, please. Program. I know what the homeless prevention is, and that's great. People got a place, help them stay there. That's good. Help them with the rent, little counseling. Now, I'm a little confused about the rapid rehousing. I'm not sure who you're going to rapidly rehouse. There's some people in the shelter right now that are making anywhere between $13 and $20 an hour, okay? A lot of them in there because they pay a child support, but they work every day. Hey man, where you going? I'm going to work. You going to work too? I'm going to work. They got permanent jobs, but they can't afford it. How much money, and heck with your assessment. The assessment should have been done as soon as they got into the emergency shelter. So I ain't worried about your assessments. But how much money are going to these folks that can rapidly move out, rapidly sustain themselves with just a little bit of help? How much money is going toward these people?
So how much money goes to somebody will be based on their individual eligibility for the program, and that's part of the eligibility process. So
has eligibility been established yet?
Yeah, it's pretty much, there's the guidance that's put forward by HUD, and then there's additional rules as well that we put out that for the implementation of the program. But it looks at just those things I mentioned: your income and what your need is, as well as your ability to, in the long run, sustain your own rent. And I just want to touch briefly, Steve, on your comment, because we can certainly come up with a better name if assessment tool is something that you know, sounds in any way other than what it was intended. But because what it is intended to be is a process by which people actually understand the individual circumstances that brought somebody into homelessness and what they're seeking and what they're needing in order to move beyond. Part of what we think is wrong with the way we do homeless services now is we think low barrier shelters mean that you can't ask anybody any questions or really engage them, that it has to be so easy for people to just be able to come in and get a bed if they're 18 or over, that we miss an opportunity to say, you know, what happened, why are you here, how can we help? And so this is more of a standardized way to say, you know, what are your needs? And because we do have a wealth of programs that we fund here in the district that we believe can help. And so that's where the assess comes from, is basically a needs assessment and the tool by which we find that. But so in no way was intended to mean anything other than we want to understand what's going on. We're not going to mandate it, we're not going to force it on anybody, but to the extent that anybody is willing to engage with us, we want to be able to meet their individualized needs, and if it's somebody, whether they have a job and they're burdened with child support and a number of bills that have prevented them from receiving housing, you know, understanding what their need is, opposed to somebody who you know, lost their job and lost their housing and became homeless and is seeking employment and is living in the shelter. And
well, we want to thank you for all of that, Laura. We really appreciate it. And I just wanted to let Councilman Wells know that you have gathered a lot of respect in the homeless community.
Thank you.
For the work that you do. We call you the bulldog for the homeless. I mean, because you're in there fighting for us. We see you at events. I saw you at the Memorial Vigil last year. Right. You have a great staff. Adam Mayer is always there when you need him. And I want to commend you on all that. What I'm hoping that out of all of this, that we can continue to examine the transparency, the accountability, the services, and the housing in the homeless community. But maybe, I know that you're always open to pulling segments of the population into your office for little meetings, and to keep you up to date on what's going on and the transferring of information. And maybe you'd be interested in maybe getting together with this streets team and maybe getting in touch with us, setting up a little meeting, maybe quarterly, maybe, you know, 3-4 times a year, or something, just for a good exchange of information. And I mean, you seem to be pretty good at that. You seem to be open to that. So I hope that you consider that.
Be happy to do that, Steve. I think that's part of my job, as you know.
And I want to thank you for being here, Councilman Wells, Laura Zeilinger, Skip Watkins, Eric Sheptop, Sage Thomas, and I'm Steve Thomas, better known as Better Believe Steve. And we're at the Central Union Mission. I want to thank all the residents of Central Union Mission for being here. Give yourselves a round of applause.
Good job, buddy. Thank you for your gift. Good job, buddy.
I'd love to meet with you again.
I'd love to continue this going. Eric, thank you.
All right. So,
Better Believe Steve here. Welcome to my home. You know, as I sit here reflecting some days later after I telecast at Central Union Mission, you know, if I had one word to express how I feel about that whole telecast, is wow. What a moment. What an unprecedented moment in the history of streets. A group of homeless individuals at a homeless shelter engaged in conversation with our city officials on the issues of homelessness as it pertains to us. That was some strong stuff, some real strong stuff. I want to take a minute at the very beginning to thank the Central Union Missions for hosting, for being our host here. They've been a great group of people. A special thanks to Miss Debbie Chambers and Mr. David Treadwell. Without you, it wouldn't have been possible. On another note, I'd just like to personally say thank you, Mr. Treadwell, for your comments to me after the show. They were very encouraging, and I'll hold them to my heart for a long time. But back to the show. Did you see that Streets team of advocates? Powerful individuals. Throughout that production, you wouldn't have known that we had a newcomer to the Streets team. We had this gentleman called Serge Thomas. I don't know whether you caught the fact that Serge was actually a resident at the Central Union Mission. Strong individual, master's degree, but yet he's in Central Union Mission. He found himself homeless, even with his master's degree. And there's people out here like that. If you in your organization or in your everyday walk, you come across some homeless individuals like a Serge or with strong personalities, like the Streets team of advocates, get in contact with us at Streets. Let's give another homeless individual an opportunity to strive to reach, educate, and transform self, as that is what we do here at Streets. It was a great occasion being there with Councilman Wells and Laura Zeilinger. It reflects the ongoing relationship that we at Streets have built with city government. It's not always a lot of time bickering back and forth. It's that we have points to make and they have points to make. You can equate our relationship somewhat like a marriage. You go home to them every night, but you don't get along every day. Sometimes there's some up and down, there's some giving and some taking. And it takes all of this to make a strong relationship. And with our Streets team of advocates, that's the type of relationship that we wish to build and we continue to build with DC government. And with Project TASH, that's examining the transparency, accountability, services, and housing of the homeless community. Councilman Wells has promised to meet with us 3-4 times a year to keep a continuing dialogue open as we seek to solve some of the problems and dig into the issues of homelessness as it applies to this city. You know, being formerly homeless myself, what a privilege it is to even be able to take this segment of the show where I'm sitting back at home in a comfortable setting after living the time that I did out on the streets. I want to throw in a plug and thank Samaritan Ends for offering me the chance to strive to reach, educate, and transform myself while in their facility. And to all the organizations that work so diligently to help get the homeless off the streets, out of the shelters. My hat go off to all of you guys